So that was great. Thank you, Tari. I think what we'll do, we'll try, rather than asking questions in the chat, I think if you just raise your hand, you can go to the reactions button, raise your hand, and I'll call on people. We'll see if that works. And to get things going, there's a few questions. I have a couple questions, and then I already have one from Alex. And maybe if you have a pen, maybe you could, I'll just put them all out there, and then you can spend as much time as you want on them. I have two questions, one on the notion of formulas and one specifically on a doctrinal claim that you made. On formulas, it's simply, what's the relationship between your notion of a formula and a much more traditional text critical understanding of a pericope? Which in my understanding is very, very close. Are you familiar with the notion of pericopes coming from text criticism?
Not really, but I mean,
well then, I mean, I'd encourage you to look at that, because that is an idea, and it's very much related to Lord's kind of understanding of how these things are reproduced, but that by working with formulas, it allows you to hold an awful lot more material in your mind at one time, and that this is the way the kind of commentarial tradition develops. This is a wonderful, actually, Paul Griffiths' PhD dissertation was a pericope analysis of meditation. He worked with meditation pericopes in the Sutta material. So put that one aside, but I think you might find it interesting to look at.
No, I mean, I've looked at that stuff. I just didn't pick up a kind of specific difference between the terms, and basically people have been using these terms interchangeably in Buddhist studies. And I mean, of course, I mean, anyhow, I can say something about that.
Okay. So the other one, just in the Avyakata questions, I have to admit, you're giving it a reading, which is, I look at it as a very traditional reading and a very Buddhist modernist reading. When he ends with the notion that it's like, what happens with fire? We know perfectly well what happens with fire when it goes out. You can't say anything about where the fire goes because there is no fire anymore. It's been nirvanized. So I think there's an argument to be made that in the early tradition, there really is no question about what happens to the Tathagata after he dies. If you buy the notion that the everything or all that exists is the senses and sense objects or the five aggregates and so on, it's gone. There is no Tathagata. The reason that it emerges in the Avyakata questions is because this is entirely conjectural. This is very bad public relations. If you want to grow a religion, even though the notion of utter annihilation makes perfect sense given the early Buddhist understanding of samsara and dukkha and so on, it's just bad press to be trying to propagate a religion that is telling you, we can help you annihilate yourself. And so the Avyakata questions on that particular issue is entirely conjectural, but it was just an attempt to save Buddhism from its own original doctrinal claims. And I think that explains why it's become popular among Buddhist modernists, because again, it's a way of saying that nirvana is not simply utter annihilation. But I just think the fact that you used the fire example is one. I just find it perplexing that anyone has any problem with what happens with the end of the fire. When the fire is gone, there's no fire there anymore. Anyways, and then I'll
answer one more. I'll take some more questions and I'll answer later.
Yeah, well, I'll give you one more. Alex's question is, what do you mean by meditation, right? What Pali term do you have in mind when you're talking about meditation and its relation to formulas?
Right. I don't have an answer for that. There is no one Pali term for meditation. I mean, in a sense, I think I'm looking for vipassana in the early tradition, but the origins of it in a sense. Of course, there's bhavana and there's different kinds of samadhi or jhana. And I think some of this stuff relates to sati. Certainly satipatthana is a kind of analytical method that does some of this kind of stuff, some of this kind of reflective, active, analytical observation. I don't think the term bhavana applies really in this context, and certainly shouldn't relate only to meditation and not to sila, for example. So I don't really have an answer for that, aside from the fact that it's clear from the text that there is a kind of coming together of a more samadhi kind of orientation. That is a kind of meditation closer to what we mean, and these analytical elements that are related to the to what I would call meditative observation. Yeah, go ahead.
And if I just may ask, some of the formulas the Buddha speaks himself and self-identifies as he does as Tathagata. So I'm wondering, doesn't that complicate it a little bit? Because, you know, at least on the face of it, it has a certain kind of narrative veneer, these passages.
Why is that a problem? In the sense of that he's not.
If you're completely literalistic in it, then you know, you may not necessarily make the move of applying what the Tathagata says about himself to your own perception of reality.
But say, for example, in this last part of the talk, he's not talking about himself. He talks about this idealized bhikkhu.
Mm-hmm.
Abhikkhu evam passam bhikkhave suttavarya savako, right? This is our hero, one who is a learned, a suttava, a Arya Savako, a noble disciple or a disciple of the noble ones, who has heard a lot, and I think probably retained something of what he's heard. He's memorized it, I would guess, but I mean that's how I understand it. And you know, these formulas, for example, there's the Pubeva me Sambodha formula. Before I was enlightened, Anabhisambuddhassa bodhisatta seva etadahos, satto etadahos. When I was only an unenlightened bodhisatta. So that is something that you stick in, not you or me, that the authors stick in order, exactly as you say, to give it a certain veneer and introduce an idea and give it prominence. I think it's a very powerful rhetorical method to put something in the Buddha's mouth, and it happens in different ways. Also, for you know, there's this formula from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the first discourse, turning of the wheel of Dharma. So then he says he wouldn't say about himself that he's anuttaram samasambodhi mabusambudho, that he's awakened to the full enlightenment and full and highest enlightenment until this or that. So this also is applied in many different contexts, and it's a way of saying this, we really care about this. And so I don't think that this, I mean, we'll always find these formulas without the Tathagata speaking about himself. And I've actually, this was in my first book, this was actually what made me focus on the theory of the 4 jhanas and 3 vijas. The main point was that this is what the Buddha narrates in his first person voice. And I thought that has narrative, that has some kind of philosophical significance.